All right, ladies, this screencast is going to continue our notes on Chapter 23, the Cold War in the 1950s, and we're going to start talking about just some other aggressions that Stalin and the Soviet Union begin taking out that make the U.S. Nervous and just kind of enter us into a more tense relationship with the Soviet Union. So, during the years after World War II, Stalin and the Soviets began taking on more of what are called satellite nations. So satellite nations are countries that are dominated politically or economically by another country. It kind of sounds like imperialism, but essentially, there's a lot of destruction after World War II, and a lot of countries need financial assistance, physical assistance for rebuilding, and you kind of have the U.S. and the Soviets competing for influence in these regions to where they would kind of come in as the heroes and help the nation rebuild, but then implement their own, economic and political systems in these regions. And so that's what a satellite nation is. And the Soviet Union is going to be very aggressive with taking on satellite nations in Eastern Europe. And remember that Eastern Europe was very devastated after World War II, so they would be looking for assistance, but they're not necessarily expecting to be, greatly influenced or taken over as the Soviet Union will be doing. So, in most cases, these countries are on the direct west of the Soviet border, but again, think like Eastern Europe, just like you're thinking Eastern Germany. And these countries would be friendly and open to communist goals, and they would allow Stalin and his regime to establish communist governments in those countries. And you can kind of see the map and see the different regions that the Soviet Union is taking on. I mean, this is growing kind of their empire in terms of communist influence. Winston Churchill is known to have given so many powerful addresses during his time as Prime Minister of Great Britain. And as the Soviets continue their aggression in Eastern Europe, he gives a speech. The speech, ironically enough, was actually given in the U.S. You don't even know that, but he gives a speech and declares that an Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. And what he's referencing, and if you look at the map, you can see this, but there's a very distinct dividing line across Central Europe that separates democratic Western Europe with communist Eastern Europe. And this shows kind of like the U.S. and Americanized, Westernized influence in Western Europe, okay, which is the left side of that line, the left side of that quote-unquote Iron Curtain. And then on the east, you see the Soviet communist influenced Eastern Europe. And just, those are two such different government systems, so distinctly different and unique, breaking the whole continent in half with their philosophies and their political ideologies. And so please know the Iron Curtain is a fictitious wall. This is not the Berlin Wall. We'll get there later in chapter 25, but you just see this like very philosophically different two regions of Europe. We're going to continue talking about some of the other plans and events that lead to increased tension with us and the Soviets, starting with the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall was the Secretary of State at the time of Truman's presidency, and most of Western Europe was in economic chaos after World War II, and we want to kind of rehabilitate their economies so that they would not fall weak and potentially be exposed to communist values. And so to help them rebuild, we are going to basically bail out Western Europe, basically provide financial aid to all Western countries that needed it, Western Europe countries, and this just kind of strengthens the economy in Western Europe, which benefits our own. So we're not doing this completely from a selfless perspective. And you don't need to confuse this with the Truman Doctrine, because this is referencing more of a preventative measure, like improving the European economy before it would even be threatened by a communist force. Like within the case of Truman, we were helping countries that needed it in that moment to fight communism, such as Greece. All right, the last two things we're going to talk about in this screencast are NATO and the Warsaw Pact, which are kind of like alliance systems formed addressing this kind of tense situation. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was a collective alliance that was created as a result of the Soviet blockade of Berlin. So the second that Stalin blockaded our access into West Berlin, we start, kind of forming this organization. So it's a collective security alliance that was formed between various nations, including the United States, Canada, Western European countries. Think of like, North Atlantic Ocean, kind of that region, regions of the country that are, and regions of the two continents that are close to the Atlantic Ocean. And basically they kind of formed as a pact, as a, that they would be defensive of each other against any kind of Soviet aggression. This is basically the same type of alliance systems we saw in World War I, where they're agreeing to like back each other up. But this is essentially like forming a line in the sand and forming a team. And you know that if the U.S. is going to form a team of, between them, Canada, Western Europe, that Stalin himself is also going to form a team. So Stalin's version of NATO, or a collective security alliance, was known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was formed in response to our formation of NATO. So it's a lot of cause and effect. The Soviet Union, blockaded Berlin. We have the airlift, as I discussed in class today. But we also now see us forming a security alliance known as NATO, and then the Soviets responding by forming their own security alliance known as the Warsaw Pact. And we will pick up with this in a later screencast, but this will be good for today. So write down any questions you have, and we will discuss further tomorrow.